Thanks very much, Peter, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to see such a big audience here at the Garvan Institute. So you heard from Michelle in the last talk that bones aren't just a solid, inert substance. They're full of living cells, different types of cells that work together to keep our bones constantly healthy. But what are bones actually made of, and what do they do? That's what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes. So let's have a really quick quiz to begin with. We can divide all the bones, the 206 bones in our body, into different classes depending on their shape and their anatomy. So in the first group of bones we have the long bones. Can anyone just shout out an example of a long bone? A femur, the femur or the tibia or the radius or the ulna. There are also bones called flat bones. Can anyone give me an example of flat bones? The scapula or the pelvis or in the skull, the flat bones. There are irregular bones. I've given that one away. The vertebrae. Any other examples of irregular bones? I can't hear too well. But what about the mandible? The mandible, the maxilla, and the jaw bones are irregular bones, or the vertebrae. And then finally, there are some peculiar bones, little cube-shaped bones called sesamoid bones, such as the patella, or small bones in the feet and the hands. So different shaped bones, what do they do? Why are they important? Well, they give us shape. Obviously, they give us the shape to the body. But the bones give us protection. So the skull protects the brain. The ribs protect the lungs and the abdominal cavity. The pelvis protects the reproductive organs. Very important for protection. But of course the skeleton allows us to move because the bones are connected to other bones and to muscles through ligaments and tendons. And the joints act as levers, if you like. They can swivel, they can move as levers. So they give us the ability to move. So what is bone tissue actually made of? It's not just made of calcium phosphate. It's made of two things. It's got calcium, a particular type of calcium phosphate, the same sort of calcium phosphate that's present in things like coral or seashells. But bone is also, very importantly, made up of protein, a particular type of protein called collagen. The calcium we get, of course, from our diet, things like green vegetables, dairy products, milk, yogurt, and so on. Beans and pulses and nuts have lots of calcium. And the protein we can make in our own bodies from amino acids that we can get from our diet. So those two things are important because the protein forms kind of a mesh in the tissue, and the calcium phosphate is then embedded within that protein mesh. And that gives bone tissue really important properties. It's hard because of the calcium, and it's strong, but it's also very flexible. The protein mesh gives bones the ability to flex a little bit, and so to absorb the mechanical forces when we walk and when we move. And you can see how important those two components are when we actually remove one or the other. So here are actually some chicken bones. And what we've done is we've removed either the calcium from the bones or we've removed the protein. So they look pretty similar here. But actually, in these little movies, you'll see what happens when we remove, first of all, the calcium. And we've just left the protein. So now the bones are very bendy. You can actually tie these in a knot. So the protein gives the bones the flexibility. If we take away the protein and we're just left with the calcium, you can see the bones are quite hard, but now they're brittle and they crumble and crush quite easily. And there'll actually be a demonstration of this during the coffee break. If you go upstairs and find Ryan at one of the display stands, there'll actually be some of those bones there, and you can have a go and see if you can tie them in a knot and crush them up. But what it shows is that those two things, the calcium phosphate and the protein, are both equally as important for making bones hard, but also strong and a bit flexible. Now, if we look more closely at the structure of the bone, there are actually two types of bone that make up the tissue. So on the outside surface, there's something called cortical bone. So this is like a shell. It's the outer, hard, very dense layer that protects the inside. But within that dense layer, there are billions of cells called osteocytes, and Michelle mentioned these in the first talk. So these are cells that are embedded within the bone tissue. And there are billions of these. If you imagine that within 1 cubic millimetre of bone tissue, that's about the size of a pinhead perhaps, there are between 50 to 100,000 of these osteocytes embedded within the bone. And they're all connected to each other via these tiny channels, these spidery connections. And that's the way that osteocytes communicate with each other. And they're important because they sense mechanical stress and load. So when we're walking and we're moving, there's fluid within these tiny channels, and that fluid sends signals to each of the connected cells. So it's a way that the cells can communicate with each other in bone, and they can sense changes in mechanical stress or load and also damage. Now that's important because it allows the skeleton to adapt to changes in mechanical load. So for example, if you're a weightlifter, that's not me, then the bones can adapt to that need, that requirement for more bone strength. But if you're an astronaut, again, that's not me, astronauts whether, say, in the Mir Russian space station or the International Space Station, they can actually lose 1 to 2% of their bone mass per month in the long bones, the pelvis, the weight-bearing bones, because they're in a weightless environment. Their bones don't need to be loaded. So those cells, the osteocytes, don't sense the need to adapt the skeleton. And astronauts can compensate for that by doing weight-bearing exercises while they're in space to keep their skeleton mechanically loaded. So that was the outside shell, the cortical bone. If you look on the inside, you saw these images from Michelle's talk earlier. So if we take a cross-section through a long bone like this using a CT scanner, and we can look on the inside, you can see this honeycomb kind of structure called trabecular or spongy bone. So this is very, very light, but it's also very, very strong. If you think of it a bit like a scaffold that's all connected together, so it can really support an awful lot of weight. And this amazing structure, well, I should just say, these gaps, and Michelle mentioned this, but these holes within this honeycomb structure are filled with the bone marrow. And that's the site of production of the red blood cells that carry the oxygen in our blood, but also the white blood cells are produced here that form a really important part of our immune system. Now this spongy sort of structure evolved very, very early in evolution. And just as an example of that, I have some woolly mammoth bone. Again, I'll be walking around with this during the coffee break if you want to come and have a look. But we actually scanned this bit of woolly mammoth bone on the CT scanner in the lab, and you can see it has almost exactly the same kind of structure as human bone. Now if I just run this movie here, hopefully you can see this even better. So woolly mammoths are about 20,000 years old, but you can see exactly the same kind of structure in dinosaurs going back 100 or 200 million years. So this really evolved very early on as a very efficient load-bearing structure. So we know that the composition of bone, the calcium, phosphate, and the protein is important. We know that the structure, the trabecular bone and the cortical bone is important. And together, those things make up what we call bone quality. Now, we don't really understand an awful lot about bone quality, and one of the projects going on here at the Garvan that's led by Professor Croucher is to identify the genes that actually contribute to keeping bones with the best quality. What genes contribute to making bones stronger or perhaps weaker if those genes don't work properly. And this is what happens in osteoporosis, that bone quality decreases. The structure of the bone becomes weaker and more susceptible to fracture. And I'll leave you with this. This is one of the ways in which we can actually begin to measure bone quality by applying a force to the bone to see how easily it snaps. And if I just run this video here, this is a time-lapse movie of a small bone that we've applied a force to it, and we can measure the force needed to actually snap the bone. And this is a very brittle bone. Bones don't usually snap in two like this, but it shows that the bone is actually very, very brittle in this example. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's given you some insights into what contributes to bone quality. And then you'll hear more in the other talks about what goes wrong in diseases such as osteoporosis, where bone quality is affected.